Excellent. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm excited to present alongside so many scholars whose work I admire. As Mikko said, I'm joining you from central New York, where it is mid-morning and quite brisk. And so I have been studying and writing about and thinking about social media for the last decade or so. And accordingly, I have taken note of something that I imagine a number of you have seen in recent weeks. Um, Articles that are prognosticating the end of social media. So some analysts are predicting a second dot-com burst. Others are forecasting the imminent death of social media. And such predictions are, of course, hyperbolic. But these widespread layoffs are a key catalyst for this. And so I'm sure many of you are aware that the Twitter has seen kind of a hemorrhaging of talent, firing half of its workforce. Meta has laid off an unprecedented 13% of its workers. Um, and perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of the coverage of this platform work has coverage on full-time employees who are in the direct line of fire. But I want to think about the many other categories of laborers who have been impacted by this shakeup. This ranges from the content moderators who are in the kind of hulking shadows of Silicon Valley companies to journalists who are trying to figure out what to do because they've courted audiences on Twitter, to many of us academics who are struggling to make sense of how to engage in our work in other contexts, given the tumult at Twitter. Um, but what I want to focus on today is how such volatility may or perhaps may not impact another category of laborers, namely social media content creators. Um, Creators are often disparaged in popular culture, but a report from 2021 ranked them as the quote fastest growing type of small business. And as we've heard from Alessandro, the creator class is scarcely monolithic. It is marked by widespread variance across platforms, across categories of work, across income labor, across income levels, and so on and so forth. And so what do I mean here? Again, Alessandro set this up perfectly in thinking about what does the term creator entail. And there's three things in particular I want to foreground in this. The first is that creators are cultural producers. And so why that's important is they are engaged in creating cultural products and expressions that shape the understanding of the mass public, and shape how we make sense of ourselves and our placement in the world. And so this distinguishes them from other categories of platform laborers, including, Uber drivers or care workers. Again, Alessandro set up this kind of idea of platform dependence. And so in this case, creative workers work across platforms, but they are dependent, they are contingent upon platforms to reach audiences, advertisers, and so on and so forth. And finally, when we're thinking about creators, I want to emphasize the fact that we think of creators as producers, but the work that they do, the labor they do, involves not just creation, but distribution, marketing, and hopefully, for those with enough pluck and luck, monetizing their content or their persona. And so I've been studying the creative community with my network of collaborators for the past 8 years or so, through various incarnations, from these sort of fashion bloggers to digital entrepreneurs to influencers to now the kind of voguish term, as I've mentioned, is creators. And though I started this work with a primary interest in how creators were working with and against and interacting with audiences and advertisers, I've increasingly become interested in the relationship between creators and the platforms on which they depend for visibility and conversely income. And so the research that I'm going to be presenting today underscores a fundamental reality that considerable research has addressed, namely that the careers born by platforms are profoundly unstable. They are bound up with flux, which is endemic to the wider social, economic, political, and as we're seeing, technological environment. So in other words, creator careers are structured by the promise, but also the precarity of visibility. And so in a 2021 article, my collaborators and I introduced a framework to hopefully make sense of some of the volatility that underpins platform-dependent creative labor. This includes unpredictability across three levels. One is market precarity, of course, the kind of whims of the larger economy and audience tastes. Industry ecology precarity, the fact that, as we are seeing right now, at any given moment, you could wake up and the platform on which you have built your livelihood vanishes. We saw this with Vine, we saw rumblings of this with TikTok, and now we're seeing it with Twitter. And finally, where I want to focus my discussion today is algorithmic precarity. Essentially, what we refer to in this article as algorithmic precarity is the fact that reckoning with algorithms or understandings, imaginaries of algorithms becomes a necessary part of the job for creators. And so a few interview quotes, which I think are really evocative and kind of highlighting how this precarity shapes the work of creators. Valerie, an Instagram artist, told me that, there are risks associated with this career. You're very much at the whims of, or excuse me, the mercy of algorithm changes or whatever the platforms are going to do. Cooper, meanwhile, who was a TikTok creator working in the comedy space, was talking about how he had found what we might think of as kind of viral success and struggled to maintain this audience. And he said something that's worth noting is the unpredictability of the algorithm on TikTok. It's not always consistent. You go through a week or two where your views are half of what they are in earlier weeks. And even if you're producing the same quality of content, this idea of you have no way of knowing how things work. But of course, there is a sense of knowing how things work, and there's a rich body of scholarship on the folk theories of algorithms, and some of the earlier work on these folk theories and trying to engage in sense making focused on users. But what's important is if you're a creator, the algorithm tweak doesn't just frustrate you, your livelihood is dependent on this. And again, Alessandro kind of highlighted to this when in the discussion of the algorithmic imaginaries that structure these careers. And so in the interviews, we found that there was such an emphasis on trying to make sense of how things work, devoting time, energy, and in some cases money. I mean, there's this like sprawling market of what Sophie Bishop calls like algorithmic experts who are peddling their self-professed expertise. So creators told us about how they would spend time in Discord groups talking about algorithms and how to get engagement and how to think about the times they wanted to post. Ella said something really compelling, how it takes hours out of her day that she could spend doing her work. And I think this kind of resonates as well with academics. Like, are we doing our work or are we promoting our work? And how do we reconcile this tension between I want to do something, but I have to think about how it can circulate. Lana, meanwhile, talked about not just the learning about algorithms, but the difficulty in learning about algorithms. And so she said, you'll spend time trying to figure out how it works, and Instagram will punish you if you do this. Instagram will reward you if you do this. And so nothing's really confirmed or denied. And she went on to say you have to do these super careful measures not to get punished by Instagram. So what do I mean by punish? This is a term that creators use quite frequently. This term of punishment circulates, and essentially it is the idea that you will be rendered invisible or less visible to audiences based on algorithms or a human moderator. And the algorithmic punishments that we heard about range considerably from being demonetized to having your content blocked or blacklisted to shadow banning, where your content isn't being seen to audiences, but you are not told that this is happening. And one of the things that emerged from our interviews is not just how pervasive these punishments are, but how inequitable they are. And so we heard consistently from marginalized creators in particular, how the system of punishment seemed to follow along their perceived social identities. So here you can see in this comment from a trans creator, how she said, every time I post this comment, I make any kind of video about the gay community, I have to kind of walk on eggshells because my fear of getting it taken down are so pervasive. And so what do creators do to kind of minimize the risk of their career as they pursue visibility and simultaneously ward off this kind of persistent threat of being invisible? My collaborator and fantastic graduate student advisee, Colton Meissner, and I developed this schema to think about what creators do. And I just want to spend the last few minutes talking about how much this kind of anticipating algorithmic punishments, fear that this could happen, shapes their experiences in ways that resonate throughout the kind of content that circulates. Excuse me. So we talked to creators about, what do you do in order to evade the threat of punishment? And a lot of them talked about kind of what reminded us in a lot of ways is the kind of censorship that we associate with traditional media industries and forms of suppression. So one creator told us that she was a self-described Asian American woman, but was afraid to use her identity descriptor in the content because she had a fear that that people in her creator community said, you use the term Asian woman and that's going to get you shadow banned. We heard from a lot of creators that said if you use the term Black in your content, that there's a potential that you could get banned or blocked from the platform. And there's a really interesting case of this happening with TikTok, which I'm happy to talk about later if anyone is curious. And I also heard this a lot from plus size creators when they were trying to thwart off what is often described as the fact that algorithms block certain levels of skin in an Instagram post. And so Tate was a fitness influencer, and she was working for an underwear brand and said, she felt very empowered by the fact that she was asked to be an influencer, a paid influencer for this brand. She said, we're told we can be free in our bodies, but then we're being shut down by platform flagging mechanisms if we show ourselves. She said there's so many accounts where you have to kind of change the content you produce because you don't want to lose their account and their livelihood. And so people often ask me, like, are these algorithmic punishments real or are they imagined? And I think one way to answer this is the fact that people act as though they are real. And Tina Bucher makes a really eloquent argument about this. And so I refer to that. But thinking about, if you understand, and that's the imaginaries literature, that you could be punished and you act in a certain way, we can see how this has implications, and quite chilling implications, for the kind of content that circulates in the public sphere. It also seems the marginalized creators have to spend an increased amount of time doing what has kind of become termed, at least in the popular press, algo speak, where you want to use hashtags to ensure that your audience sees the content, but you fear that you might be dinged by the algorithm. So there were really creative workarounds. One was people did not want to refer to sex in their hashtags, so they would use SEGGS, not using hashtags like cross-dresser or gender fluid because these are perceived as those that could potentially get you punished by the algorithms. So referring to other hashtags which are seen as having a better chance of visibility. One of my favorite ones, which I've talked about before, is the use of, if you want to talk about an algorithm and you don't want to say algorithm, you write Al Gore, the former vice president of the US, rhythms as kind of one of these workarounds. And what I finally want to touch on is the way in which systems of social and technical capital, or at least perceived social and technical capital, help individuals or hurt individuals who've been punished or fearing punishment. And so in particular, people would talk about how they would be punished by the algorithm and they would file an appeals process with Instagram or TikTok. They would say, I've been unfairly targeted. And there was this pervasive sense that if you knew someone at the company, well, that would protect you or that would help you get your content back. And so one creator said, Instagram never responds unless you know someone who works there. Another said, one of my friends has a management company and they have an insider at TikTok. And so they tell her what hashtags to use in order to avoid the algorithm or which ones not to use. We heard something similar about on YouTube, not just in terms of social identity, but in terms of if you are part of what Kaplan and Gillespie talk about, the kind of tiered system where if you're part of the club, YouTube will help you figure out what types of content to get seen, whereas if you're a smaller creator, you don't have that same mechanism of recourse. And finally, thinking about the way in which perceived bias may impact this appeals process, I have this kind of lengthy quote up here from Lynn where she talked about when you are flagged or banned, you reach out to the company and ask them for further information or ask them to reinstate your account or ask them to make your content more visible. Again, this kind of provision of visibility. And to Lynn, what happens is it's good to file an appeal because you have an actual person looking rather than just the AI. But at the same time, if this person has potential bias, they are going to make the decision about whether your content gets seen or not seen. And so there's where we can think about the importance of humans within this kind of socio-technical environment about making these decisions. So how can we make sense of this in a larger structure? What are some of the conclusions that I want to draw? One is that algorithmic sense making is part of the invisible labor that structure these careers. As I mentioned earlier, there's this allure of being a creator where you have a sense of expression that you want to put out there in the world. And the reality is that creators spend a great deal of time thinking about how to be visible and conversely, how to not be made invisible. And this kind of eclipses some of the creative elements of their careers. Recall the artist who wanted to do her work, but instead was spending time combing through Reddit forums in order to figure out how to promote herself. Alternatively, I want to think about how, there's been considerable attention to how visibility is unevenly allocated in the platform economy. But I also want to think about how platform invisibility and punishments are allocated quite unevenly in the creator economy. And I want to draw this attention to this quote, which is within a context of the traditional workplace, but I found it really useful in thinking about this tension between hypervisibility and invisibility. Namely that hypervisibility and invisibility are contrast to visibility and represent different manifestations of the same oppressive forces, subjugation and devaluation. And so in closing, going back to this question that I had at the beginning, like, is this the end of social media? And certainly I don't have the answer to that, or I would be a billionaire and a future predictor. But sociologies of creative work have made clear that one of the elements of being a creative is withstanding the vicissitudes and the ebbs and flows of the marketplace and kind of dealing with, as sociologists talk about, this kind of radical conditions of uncertainty. And so the platform economy amplifies many of these forms of uncertainty, as I've talked about today and as we've seen in recent weeks. So one sort of auspicious take is that cultural workers will best be able to weather the storm of the social media shakeup because they are so used to dealing with precarity. But alternatively, given the kind of social, economic, and political realities of platform-dependent labor, a more likely and worrying scenario is one in which the tiers between the creator classes only widens. And that remains to be seen. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.